My lover left me to die after a failed hit on the kingpin. The wounded beast demanded my service, his gaze colder than the steel in his hand. The acrid stench of gunpowder lingered, clinging to the luxurious rugs beneath my knees, the scent of blood a stark contrast to the polished marble floor. Screams of terror had faded into agonizing moans, and the rapid fire of guns had turned into the slow drip of life escaping through a bullet wound. I hadn't even seen it coming. How could I? Just moments ago I had shared a quiet kiss with Xander, my lover, in the chaos of the ballroom. It was nothing more than a stolen moment between us amidst the power games being played around us. His lips had been hurried, his eyes desperate, glimmering with something dark, something I couldn't place. And then, without a word, he was gone. Lost in the crush of bodies fleeing the explosion. I fell to my knees beside the beast, the kingpin, Dominic Volkov. His body was a mountain of muscle and rage, now laying still and lifeless in front of me, his dinner jacket stained with blood. My heart hammered in my chest, both from the terror of what had just happened and the realization that Xander, my love, had been behind it. The man I had trusted, the man who kissed me in the shadows, had orchestrated this chaos and left me to deal with the consequences. Then, a low, guttural sound cut through the silence. My eyes locked on his. Dominic's eyes, as cold and unforgiving as a storm's eye. His piercing gaze found mine, a silent command passing between us. In an instant, everything shifted. This wasn't just about saving him. This was about survival. The fact that he was still alive seemed impossible. The explosion had ripped through the ballroom, bodies falling around us, and yet he was here, alive, bleeding and looking at me with a chilling intensity. The realization hit me harder than the blast itself. He wasn't here by accident. He was demanding my skill, my knowledge, my service. And the worst part? I had no choice but to obey. My training had taught me to focus, to assess, to act. It had been years in the making. Years of pulling people back from the brink of death. Years of healing the broken. But none of that prepared me for this. To save the life of a man who was as dangerous as the city itself. I could feel my hands shaking, slick with blood that wasn't mine. Yet my oath was clear. Save lives, no matter who they are. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into the full story. And there, in that ballroom-turned-war zone, surrounded by death and chaos, I had to make a choice. It was clear now. Xander's betrayal wasn't a random act. It was part of a much bigger scheme, and I had just been pulled deeper into the heart of it. But as Dominic's cold eyes locked onto mine, I realized something else. This wasn't just about healing wounds, it was about survival. And in a world like this, survival meant surrendering to the beast, to the very man who had brought me to my knees. Everything in me screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, but another part of me, the part honed by years in the emergency room, whispered, "Do your job, save him, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get out alive." But then again, in a world where betrayal lurked in every corner, who could truly say what being alive even meant? As my hands fumbled for my medical kit, my mind raced through my options. Dominic was still alive, but the wound was deep. My kit was inadequate, and I needed more than sterile bandages and a few vials of lidocaine. But I had no choice. My survival depended on this man, on saving him, even though I wanted nothing more than to leave him behind. He had just claimed my service, my soul, and now, my life was tied to his. It was a thought I couldn't shake, even as the chilling weight of it settled into the pit of my stomach. I had saved Dominic Volkov's life, and now, my survival was bound to his whims. There was no escaping him, no running away. Not anymore. They dragged me through the labyrinthine corridors of his mansion, rough hands pulling me along as if I were a piece of discarded property. I didn't fight them. There was no point. Even if I had tried, it wouldn't have mattered. Dominic's men were too many, too powerful. Each one a silent sentinel, their faces grim and unreadable as they ushered me deeper into his lair. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even a mansion. It was a fortress. I had seen wealth before, luxury beyond most people's reach. But this place was different. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. the air thick with the scent of old money and power. Expensive art adorned the walls, the kind that cost more than most countries' GDPs. Gilded furniture, marble floors that gleamed even in the dim light, and corridors that twisted in on themselves like a maze, designed to disorient anyone foolish enough to try to escape. But it wasn't just the opulence that made it a prison. It was the fear. The palpable, suffocating fear that hung in the air, threading through every room, every hallway. As I was led through the corridors, I couldn't help but wonder just how much of this place was built to keep people in, and how much was built to keep people out. Dominic Volkov, the man I had been forced to save, wasn't just some crime boss. He was a kingpin, no, a god, ruling over this dark kingdom with an iron fist. But unlike the false gods people worshipped in their ivory towers, Dominic ruled from the shadows. There were no grand speeches, no crowds cheering his name. He didn't need any of that. His empire stretched far beyond this mansion, far beyond the city. He controlled industries, governments, people, lives. Everything and everyone in his reach bent to his will. I had seen the power in his eyes, the cold, calculating control he had over his own men. But it wasn't just physical dominance. Dominic Volkov wasn't just a beast. He was the beast. The embodiment of ruthless, silent power that moved behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the underworld. If I had thought him to be just a man before, I quickly realized that I had been gravely mistaken. We stopped in front of a large door, its wood as black as night, the handles made of polished gold. 2 guards stood on either side, their eyes trained on me, their hands resting on their weapons. I could feel their gaze on me, watching my every move, assessing my worth. My breath hitched as the door swung open. Inside was a room that could have been taken straight from a horror story. The lights were harsh, flickering with an unnatural intensity that made the whole space feel cold and clinical. The walls were lined with equipment, medical equipment, but not the kind you'd find in a hospital. This was a makeshift operating room, and I immediately knew what it meant. Dominic Volkov, despite his wealth and empire, had anticipated the violence that would come with his lifestyle. He had prepared for it. And now, I was part of that preparation. They shoved me forward, and I stumbled into the center of the room, the cold steel beneath my feet a sharp contrast to the soft rugs I had walked on moments ago. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were lined with surgical tools, each one gleaming in the fluorescent light. But they weren't just tools. They were weapons. This was Dominic Volkov's personal arena, and he had designed it with precision and malice. Before I could gather my thoughts, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Dominic Volkov entered the room with slow, deliberate steps. His movements were calm, calculated, like a predator sizing up its prey. His imposing frame filled the doorway, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He was still bleeding, the blood from the wound in his side staining the pristine white of his shirt. His face was pale, but his eyes, those cold, storm-swept eyes, were still sharp, still piercing. Doessa. He said my name like a command, not a request. It wasn't a name he spoke in affection. It was a name spoken with ownership, with the weight of someone who claimed everything in his orbit. I stood still, unwilling to acknowledge the trembling in my hands. I hated him. I hated everything about this world he had dragged me into. But I was smart enough to know that hate wouldn't save me. Survival would. He eyed me for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over me like he was inspecting an object rather than a person. Finally, he nodded to the metal table in the center of the room. "You will help me," he said, his voice low, controlled, like he was stating a fact rather than asking a question. I swallowed hard. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I couldn't show weakness. Not now, not with him. He moved to the table, his hands resting against the edge as he looked over at me. "You will treat this wound. The bullet is still inside me. I don't care how you do it, but I will live. You will make sure of that." I felt my stomach tighten. He was ordering me to perform surgery on him, not just a random man, but the kingpin of this entire empire, the very man who controlled everything and everyone around me. But I had no choice. If I didn't do this, I knew I wouldn't make it out alive. Dominic Volkov didn't kill out of anger. He killed out of necessity. And I was just another tool to him now, another piece in his carefully crafted machine. I nodded, though the idea of cutting into his flesh made my skin crawl. I need proper tools, I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. This isn't a minor wound. You need an operating room, not a table in a dungeon. His lips twitched, the slightest hint of amusement in those cold eyes. I have everything you need, he said. You are not here to question my arrangements, Dwessa. You are here to save me. The challenge in his words didn't go unnoticed. He wasn't just dictating my actions, he was daring me to refuse him. And I knew better than to cross him. Not now, not when my survival depended on it. He motioned to the side, and one of the guards stepped forward, carrying a large metal case. He set it down with a thud in front of me, and I saw the gleaming, pristine surgical tools inside. A full set, ready for use. This wasn't just a contingency plan for a one-time emergency. This was his world, a world where he had prepared for everything, down to the finest detail. I opened the case slowly, my hands trembling despite myself. The sight of the tools, the clean, shining instruments, sent a wave of nausea through me. But I forced it down. I was a surgeon. I had saved countless lives in my career. This was no different, even if the patient in front of me was the monster of the underworld. I turned back to him, his gaze still fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering. Get on the table, I ordered, my voice firm, despite the trembling that still lingered beneath my calm exterior. He didn't hesitate. Dominic Volkov climbed onto the table without a word, settling into position as if this were just another ordinary operation. I moved swiftly, gathering the instruments I would need. I knew the wound was deep, dangerously close to his internal organs, but I also knew what I had to do. My hands moved with practiced precision as I prepared to save his life. Dominic Volkov was no longer just the kingpin of this city. He was my patient, and that meant my oath, my duty, demanded that I save him, no matter the cost. The thought churned my stomach. But I pushed it aside. My survival depended on him, and in this world of violence and power, survival was all that mattered. But even as I focused on the task at hand, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that in saving him, I had traded one form of captivity for another. And in this world, Dominic Volkov was both the beast I feared and the man I needed. The weight of my decision pressed down on me as the days passed in Dominic Volkov's fortress. I had saved him. I had stitched up his wound, held his life in my hands, and now I was paying the price. He had returned to full strength faster than I anticipated. His body a testament to the raw resilience that made him a kingpin, a beast in a world of wolves. He had been calm and silent during the entire recovery, the only sign of his injury being the faint scar that would soon fade beneath the bulk of his dark suits. And I had been relegated to the shadows, bound to the life I had saved. But now, as I sat in the sterile clinical room where he had laid, recovering, I knew that everything was about to change. He had never been the kind of man who left anyone in limbo for long. Amelia. He said my name as if it were a command, his deep voice rich with power. I looked up, finding his cold eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. It's time we talk about your future. I tried not to flinch at the finality in his words. It wasn't an invitation to negotiate. It was an announcement. He leaned back in the chair opposite me, his legs crossed as he regarded me. There was something calculating in his expression, something that spoke of the weight of his empire, how every decision he made rippled out into the world, affecting countless lives, including my own. You've done well, he continued, his tone not quite a compliment, but more of a statement of fact. You saved me. That means something. I swallowed the bitter taste that rose in my throat. I had saved him, yes, but at what cost? His empire, this life, was one I had never wanted to be a part of. Yet here I was, kneeling at the altar of it, with no way to escape. I'll offer you a choice, he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands steepled in front of him. You can leave. Walk out of here with full protection. with money, with a new life. All the resources you need to fade into the background of this world, to disappear. You will be free. A faint flicker of hope stirred in my chest. But I quickly smothered it. I knew too well that nothing came without a price in Dominic Volkov's world. There were no free passes, no kindnesses, not even for a life saved. His eyes never left mine as he continued. Or you can stay. Become a part of my empire, not just as a healer, but as a strategist. Your skills, your mind, are far too valuable to waste. You'll have power, influence, and resources beyond your wildest dreams. But in return, you will serve me. And there will be no running away. The words hung in the air between us like a silent ultimatum. He gave me no time to think, no space to breathe. His empire was vast, and he expected loyalty, unquestioning, unwavering loyalty. I could leave. I could try to carve out a life elsewhere, to run far from the blood-stained world I had entered by accident. But deep down, I knew that would be a lie. Xander had made sure of that. The betrayal had already locked me into this world of shadows, and Dominic Volkov was the key to everything. The thought of leaving, of running away and pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen, heard what I had heard, felt what I had felt, seemed impossible. Even if I tried, Xander's connections in the criminal world would track me down, drag me back into the chaos. There would be no safety. Not for me. Not anymore. Xander. The thought of him hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just a man I had loved. He was a traitor, and I had been a pawn in his game. The full extent of Xander's betrayal didn't hit me until the moment I overheard a conversation between two of Dominic's enforcers. They didn't know I was in the room when they spoke, but I heard enough. Xander had been working against Dominic for months, feeding information to rival factions, setting up the hit that had nearly killed the Kingpin. He hadn't just been some disillusioned lover caught in the crossfire. He had planned this. He had orchestrated the entire disaster. A sick realization curled in my stomach. Xander hadn't betrayed me just because of ambition. He had used me to further his own goals. He had left me to die, but not because he cared about my fate. No, it was because I was a loose end to him, a piece of the puzzle he needed to throw away once he had what he wanted. The betrayal felt like a raw wound, one that I couldn't escape, even now. Xander had left me behind to pick up the pieces, and I had been foolish enough to believe in him. But what did I have left now? Dominic's world was cold, merciless, and dark, but it was the only world I had. I turned my attention back to Dominic, whose eyes had never left me. His gaze was a steady force, and in that moment, I saw the control he had over every piece of this empire. He wasn't offering me freedom. He was offering me a life within his cage. "I can't leave," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. My voice trembled, but I didn't care. The truth was that I had no choice. Dominic Volkov had claimed me, whether I liked it or not. His world was my world now. The chains that bound me were invisible, but they were real, and they were tightening around my throat. His lips curled into a faint smile. He had known my answer before I spoke it. He knew I wouldn't leave. No one left his world without paying a price. And even if I could walk away, I'd still be hunted by the shadows I had stepped into. "You're wise," he said, his voice low and smooth like velvet. "There's no place for weakness in this world. And you, Amelia, you're not weak. You never were." The words stung, but they also gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. In a world where everyone was either predator or prey, I had just moved from prey to something else. Something dangerous. "Do you know why I'm offering you this?" Dominic asked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. "It's not because I care about you, Amelia. It's because you're valuable, and I don't waste valuable assets." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. There was no kindness in his words. There was only calculation, control, and ownership. "But make no mistake," he continued, his tone growing darker, more commanding. "If you choose to stay, you'll belong to me. Not just in name, but in every sense of the word. You'll be mine to use, to command, as I see fit. And if you try to leave, there will be nowhere to run." I nodded slowly, the reality of my situation sinking deeper. Dominic's world had swallowed me whole, and now I had to decide how I would survive in it. There was no escaping it now. My pride, my desire for freedom, they had no place here. The world I had once dreamed of, the life I had thought I could build outside of this, had been a lie. Xander had stolen that from me. The only choice left was to serve Dominic Volkov, or be consumed by the very empire he had built. I chose to serve, and in doing so, I chose survival. I stayed. The words echoed in my head as I walked through the dimly lit hallways of Dominic Volkov's estate. My life had irrevocably shifted, and I had made the choice to surrender myself to this dark world. Not because I wanted to, not because I saw any kind of redemption in it, but because survival required it. Dominic had made it clear that there was no leaving his world, not if I wanted to live. The mansion had become a prison, yes, but it also served as my sanctuary, one that kept me safe from the ever-looming threat of Xander and the rival factions. It was strange how safety could feel so suffocating. But there was no denying it. My survival now depended entirely on Dominic. The very man I had once despised, the very man whose life I had saved, was the one who held all the cards. Days turned into weeks. Each day, I found myself sinking deeper into Dominic Volkov's empire, and every passing hour solidified my new role in his world. I had once been a surgeon with a purpose, a healer who found solace in saving lives, but now I was something else, a tool, a piece in a grander scheme, one orchestrated by a man who saw everyone around him as either an asset or a liability. I had hoped, at first, that my medical expertise would simply serve as my way out. I would save him, keep him alive, and perhaps one day find the courage to slip away unnoticed. But Dominic Volkov was no fool. He knew my worth. He knew how valuable my skills were, and he had no intention of letting me go. Not until I had served him in ways I had yet to understand. I wasn't a pawn in his game. I was a queen, and queens never walked away. The first time I truly felt the weight of my decision was when I stood beside him in that sterile, cold operating room. The hum of the machines, the sharp metallic smell of antiseptic. It all felt too familiar, too clinical. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, I wasn't just a surgeon. I was Dominic Volkov's personal physician, a role I hadn't asked for, yet one I had found myself thrust into with no way out. His wound had healed, but his need for me didn't end there. No. Now, I was expected to oversee every injury, every cut, every scrape that came through the doors of his empire. He didn't trust anyone else, not even his closest enforcers. I had become a part of his world, a vital piece of it. I had saved his life once, but now he was the one keeping me alive. I couldn't help but notice how much I was starting to respect him. It was a thought that repulsed me. How could I, a woman who had sworn an oath to heal and protect, come to respect a man like Dominic Volkov? But there it was. His ruthlessness, his genius, his sheer intelligence demanded admiration. His control over everything and everyone was total. It wasn't just physical strength, though that was part of it. It was his mind. His ability to calculate every move, every action, and manipulate events to his advantage was something I had never encountered before. Dominic wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, and I was drawn to it. Even when I loathed myself for it, I couldn't escape it. There were moments, brief but undeniable, when I found myself captivated by him. When I saw him move through his empire, no longer a patient in my operating room, but the man who commanded everything. It was hard to deny his magnetism. He was power personified, and I, for all my moral objections, couldn't stop myself from being pulled into his orbit. But as much as I began to recognize his strength, I also started to understand why people feared him. I had always thought of Dominic Volkov as a monster, a heartless kingpin who ruled through violence and intimidation. But the more I observed, the more I understood. Violence was just a tool, a necessary tool, but still just a tool. His real strength came from his ability to bend people to his will. He didn't need to threaten everyone around him. He simply offered them a choice, loyalty or death. And for most of his men, loyalty came with power, money, and respect. I began to see the complexities of his operations. The Volkov Empire wasn't a simple criminal organization. It was a web of influence that stretched through every part of society, from politicians to business moguls to the lowliest street dealers. Dominic's reach was absolute. His power didn't just rest on brute force. It was woven into the fabric of everything in this city. The more I worked for him, the more I understood the delicate balance he maintained. He wasn't just a kingpin in a world of chaos. He was the king of that chaos, orchestrating every move, every deal, every conflict to suit his interests. And I was starting to realize that, in this world, loyalty was everything. Loyalty meant survival. It meant protection. And Dominic had a way of making sure his people remained loyal. Not through fear alone, but by giving them everything they could ever want: power, wealth, influence, so long as they pledged their allegiance to him. I had seen the loyalty his men had for him, the way they moved with a purpose, the way they followed him without question. It wasn't just about fear, it was about respect. They knew that crossing Dominic Volkov meant not just death, but the end of everything they had worked for. That's when I realized I was starting to understand why I couldn't leave. The empire I had found myself a part of wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something I had only begun to understand. At first, I thought it was just about Dominic's hold over me, how his control, his power, made escape impossible. But as I spent more time in his world, I began to see it differently. There was a twisted loyalty to him that ran deeper than mere submission. His empire wasn't just a reflection of his power, it was a reflection of the way people wanted to belong. They craved his approval, his protection, his recognition. And in a world where everything could be taken from you in an instant, that loyalty was a rare, precious commodity. But as I began to take on more responsibility, my role in Dominic's world shifted. I was no longer just the woman who had saved his life. I was becoming something more, something integral to the survival of his empire. As my role as his personal physician expanded, so did my influence. I was no longer just tending to the wounds of his men. I was becoming a part of the decision-making process, a trusted asset in Dominic Volkov's inner circle. I had saved him, yes, but now I was becoming indispensable. I knew too much. I had seen too much. And that meant I was tied to him, in every sense of the word. And while I hated myself for it, I also knew that in this world, loyalty wasn't just a choice. It was a survival mechanism. The moment I had chosen to stay, I had made my decision. There was no going back now. Dominic Volkov had claimed me, and in doing so, he had made me his. There would be no escape, not as long as I drew breath. The day Xander returned to Dominic Volkov's empire was the day I realized there would be no escaping my past. No matter how deep I buried it, how far I tried to run, it was always going to find me, stalking me like a ghost, lurking in the corners of every room I entered. And this time, it came back with a vengeance. It was early morning when the news came. A quiet knock on my door, a shadow crossing the threshold of my room. I looked up from my desk, my eyes still bleary with the remnants of sleep. There, standing in the doorway, was one of Dominic's enforcers. His eyes were dark, serious. He didn't speak at first. But the gravity in his gaze made my pulse quicken. Something was wrong. "Amelia," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "He's back. Xander's here." The name hit me like a slap. My breath caught in my throat, the weight of it stealing the air from my lungs. Xander. I hadn't thought about him much, not since the night everything had changed, not since the explosion that had left me broken and betrayed. But the mention of his name brought a flood of memories, memories I wasn't ready to face. How he had once been the center of my world, how his love had felt so real, so raw. And then, how he had left me to die, a pawn in his game. I could already feel the pull, the instinct to run, to hide, to avoid facing him. But I knew there was no running from Xander. Not now, not in this world. When I entered the room, he was waiting. He stood near the large windows, staring out at the sprawling city below. His posture was the same, confident and controlled, as though nothing had changed. But I could see the difference in him. There was something darker in his eyes, something colder. It was the same look I had seen when he had left me behind, when he had walked away without so much as a second glance. "Amelia," he said, his voice smooth, calm. But there was a tension there, a hint of desperation beneath the facade. He turned toward me, his face betraying nothing but the faintest trace of guilt. "I never meant for it to go like this. I never wanted to hurt you." The words felt hollow, like a rehearsed apology. I didn't want to hear them. Not after everything he had done. The betrayal still burned in my chest, a raw wound that wouldn't heal. His words couldn't undo what had been done. "What do you want, Xander?" I asked, my voice flat, betraying none of the anger that was clawing at me. I had learned to hide it, learned to bury it deep inside, but I couldn't suppress the disappointment that lingered in my heart. He wasn't the man I had once loved. He was a stranger now, someone who had used me, manipulated me, and left me behind when it suited him. "I'm not here to explain myself," Xander said, his tone darkening, as though he had come to some silent conclusion. "I'm here because I need you. You're the only one who can help me regain my standing. I know what happened between us. Everything. But this is bigger than you and me. It's about survival." Survival. The word stung. Xander's world, the world I had once been so eager to be a part of, was nothing more than a game of power and manipulation. To him, everything was transactional. There were no real feelings, no bonds that could withstand the weight of ambition. "I was a pawn, Xander," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "You used me to get what you wanted. You betrayed me, and now you want me to help you again? After everything?" He stepped closer, his eyes softening, the mask of confidence slipping for just a moment. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. Everything, it was never personal. It was about the game, the bigger picture. Dominic Volkov is a monster, and we both know he's a threat to everyone. But you're my way back in. You're the one person who can get me the leverage I need to take him down." I stared at him, my chest tightening. How could I have been so blind? How could I have ever believed in him? His words, his promises, they were all empty. He had left me in the cold, abandoned me in the middle of that chaos, and now he wanted me to fix his mess. "I'm not your pawn anymore, Xander," I said, the words harder than I had intended. "You've already made your choice, and now I've made mine." The door slammed open, and Dominic walked in, his presence overwhelming as always. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, his cold gaze flicking from me to Xander, taking in the tension between us. His eyes narrowed, calculating, as he assessed the situation. "Xander, you've returned," he said, his voice smooth, devoid of any emotion. "It's been a while." Xander didn't flinch, though I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had been part of Dominic's world once, before he betrayed him, and now he was back, trying to reclaim his place. But Dominic was not a man who tolerated betrayal, not even from his own. "I need your help, Dominic," Xander said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm willing to work with you. Together, we can take control of everything." Dominic's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You're not part of the equation anymore, Xander," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You were a tool I once used, but now you're nothing more than a liability, and I don't tolerate liabilities." Xander froze, his face paling as the weight of Dominic's words sank in. He had no power here anymore. Not in Dominic Volkov's world. "I'm done with you," Dominic continued, his tone final, unforgiving. "You don't get to come back into my life, not after what you've done. And you certainly don't get to drag Amelia into your mess." I didn't know what to feel. Part of me was relieved. Xander was gone. Again. He no longer had the power to hurt me, to manipulate me into doing his bidding. But the other part of me, the part that had once loved him, felt the sting of that finality. It wasn't just his betrayal that had shattered me. It was the realization that I had never really known him, that everything I had believed in had been a lie. And yet, I could never go back. Not to Xander, not to the life I had once dreamed of. I had committed to Dominic now. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the unspoken understanding between us. Dominic's eyes shifted back to me, the weight of his gaze settling on my shoulders. His control over the situation was absolute. Xander had been dismissed, and I was left standing in the aftermath, a pawn in a much larger game. "You've made your choice, Amelia," Dominic said, his voice soft but commanding. "Now, you must prove your loyalty. And loyalty, in my world, is everything. If you want to survive here, you will serve me. Without hesitation, without question. There's no place for half measures." The words hung in the air, like chains being locked around my wrists. I had chosen Dominic Volkov's world, and now I had to live with the consequences of that choice. I looked at Xander, standing there, broken, defeated. The man I had once loved was nothing more than a shadow now, a reminder of my past mistakes, and as much as it hurt, I knew I had to sever those ties completely. "I'm done with you," I said to Xander, the words ringing in the silence. He didn't respond, his gaze empty, resigned. I turned to face Dominic, my resolve hardening. This was the world I had chosen. This was my life now. And there was no turning back. The fragile thread that bound me to Dominic Volkov felt more precarious with each passing day. It wasn't a bond forged from affection or trust, not truly. It was built on necessity, survival, and something else, something I hadn't yet fully understood. Perhaps it was respect, or perhaps it was the strange magnetism of his power that kept me anchored to his world. Whatever it was, I knew that my fate was now tied to his empire, just as much as I was tied to my own survival. The days had blurred into one another since Xander's return and subsequent departure, a painful reminder of the past I couldn't escape. In the aftermath, I found myself spending more time with Dominic, my role as his personal physician expanding far beyond the confines of a sterile operating room. Dominic had made it clear that I was invaluable to him. My medical expertise was essential to his operations. But there was something else, something deeper that kept me close to him. His trust in me was not given freely. It had been earned, slowly, through necessity and the unspoken understanding that we both knew what it was like to be betrayed, to be left vulnerable in a world where power was the only currency. I had seen him at his weakest, bleeding and broken, and now, in return, he allowed me glimpses of his empire. He didn't hide his ruthlessness from me, but there were moments, fleeting as they were, where I saw something more in him, something that hinted at a mind, sharp and calculating, driven by a vision beyond mere survival. That's how it started, the strange dynamic between us. Trust, formed on the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual need. Dominic Volkov, for all his power, was still a man who could bleed, who could die, and who needed something that I could provide, my expertise. And I, for all my disgust at the world he had created, had no choice but to respect the intelligence and the ruthlessness with which he ruled it. It was never easy, though. Our interactions were still fraught with manipulation, a delicate dance of control. He didn't trust me completely, nor did I trust him. But the tension, the constant push and pull between us, made it clear that we had entered into a dangerous alliance, one based on survival, on necessity, but never on friendship or loyalty. My role within his empire had grown. What had started as a simple position as his personal physician had expanded into something far more complex. Dominic had brought me into his inner circle, into the heart of his operations. I was no longer just tending to the wounds of his men. I was part of the decision-making process. I was expected to use my medical knowledge to help strategize, to assess risks, and at times to make decisions that affected the very life of his empire. It wasn't just the physical wounds I treated anymore. I had become embroiled in his plans, helping him navigate the political and strategic decisions that kept his empire running. And in doing so, I began to understand the delicate balance of power that kept it all intact. Dominik Volkov didn't just rule with brute force. He ruled with intellect, with precision, and with a network of alliances and debts that stretched far beyond the city's borders. I saw it, more and more each day, the intricate web of loyalty and manipulation that made his empire thrive. His power wasn't just about fear, it was about influence. He didn't need to be everywhere at once. His reach extended through others, through trusted men and women who acted on his behalf. And I, too, was becoming part of that web. But as Dominik's power grew, so too did the enemies who sought to bring him down. The whispers of his growing influence had reached the ears of rival factions, and it didn't take long before attacks were launched against him. I watched, helpless, as Dominik's enemies began closing in. Every corner of his empire was under threat, from rival crime families to corrupt politicians who feared what he could do with the power he was amassing. It wasn't just his bodyguards and enforcers who were at risk now. Dominik Volkov had become a target, and in this world, targets didn't just get shot. They were erased. I found myself at the center of this storm, caught between my growing loyalty to him and my desire to escape the chaos. I had always been a survivor, but now survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about choosing sides, about becoming an active player in this world of darkness and power. Dominik Volkov had given me no choice. The first attack came unexpectedly, an assassination attempt aimed at Dominik himself. We were at one of his private estates, an isolated mansion that served as both a safe house and a hub for his operations. I had just finished tending to his wounds from a minor skirmish the day before when we were hit. The gunfire was sudden, deafening, and chaotic. I had barely finished securing the door to his personal suite when the first wave of attackers breached the perimeter. His men, trained to respond quickly, were already moving into position, but Dominik was calm, so calm it was almost eerie. He didn't rush to action. He observed, he calculated, and then he reacted. The next few hours were a blur of violence and strategy. Dominik moved with deadly precision, ordering his men with an ease that belied the danger they were all in. I watched, stunned and slightly horrified, as he dispatched threats with ruthless efficiency. It was like a chess game to him, every piece moving according to his plan, and I was left to clean up the mess. The wounded, the dying, the screams. I had become not just his physician, but his caretaker, his protector in the field, making decisions that affected the lives of his men, and in some cases, my own. It wasn't the violence that disturbed me the most, though. It was the realization that, in these moments, I was becoming part of the machine. My hands, once dedicated solely to healing, were now part of a world where those very hands could take lives. The line between healer and killer blurred with each passing day, and I found myself questioning how much longer I could keep walking this tightrope. But the real test came when Dominik called me into his office after the dust had settled. The mansion was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the attack hanging over us like a dark cloud. He sat behind his desk, his face unreadable, his eyes focused on something unseen as he contemplated the future of his empire. "You did well today," he said, his voice cold but not unkind. It was a compliment, though it lacked any real warmth. Still, I took it for what it was, an acknowledgement of my role in his survival. But there was something else in his voice, something that sent a shiver through me. "You're an asset now, Amelia," he continued, his eyes finally meeting mine. "Not just to me, but to the Empire, and I expect you to take on a bigger role moving forward." The words were clear. I was no longer just a doctor. I was part of his plan, part of the machinery that kept his empire running. I had proven my worth, and now I had to pay the price. And so, the days turned into weeks, and the lines between me and Dominik Volkov continued to blur. I had made my choice. I had chosen survival, and in doing so, I had become an integral part of his world, a world of power, violence, and manipulation. But the tension between us still simmered beneath the surface. There were moments, brief moments, when I caught a glimpse of the man behind the empire, the man who had bled, who had suffered, and who now demanded my loyalty in return for my life. And in those moments, I couldn't help but feel something for him. Something dangerous. Something I couldn't afford to acknowledge. I was trapped in this world, and so was he. And in the dangerous alliance we had formed, I knew that there would be no easy way out. Survival. That word had become my mantra, my lifeline. Every decision, every moment I spent in Dominic Volkov's world was a step toward survival. There was no room for hesitation, no space for weakness. And if I had ever harbored any illusion that I was merely a healer, a physician working quietly behind the scenes, those days were over. Now, I was something more. I was part of his empire. Whether I liked it or not, I was an active player in this brutal game. And today, that reality would be tested. It began as a quiet morning. I had just finished my rounds, checking on the injured men, ensuring that everyone under Dominic's care was stable. I had learned to move quickly, efficiently, my hands becoming extensions of his empire. But no matter how much I immersed myself in the work, I couldn't escape the gnawing unease that had settled deep inside me. Every day felt like a game of survival, one where I wasn't sure if I was winning or losing. Dominic was in his study when the attack came. I had been called to his office under the guise of checking on his health, but the moment I walked in, the tension was thick in the air. Dominic was already standing, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the monitors in front of him. The grim expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. "Amelia," he said, his voice cold but steady. "It's begun." Before I could react, the loud explosion echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion. Too close. The walls shuddered with the force of it, and the sound of gunfire followed, sharp and unrelenting. The Volkov Empire was under attack. Without another word, Dominic moved, his every action measured, calculated. He grabbed a briefcase from beneath the desk and opened it to reveal a series of weapons. It was almost like a ritual. This was Dominic Volkov, the untouchable kingpin, responding to a threat with the cold efficiency that made him a god in this world. But this time, it wasn't just his men who would fight back. This time, it was me too. "You'll need to move quickly," Dominic said, his voice dropping lower as he handed me a small tactical knife. "We've got enemies inside. Enemies. Plural." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been trained as a surgeon, but now, I was about to put everything I had learned to a very different test. Dominic wasn't asking for a doctor. He was asking for a fighter. And despite the turmoil inside me, I knew there was no turning back. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly, his eyes locking onto mine. I looked at him, standing there, no longer just a ruthless leader, but a man who had seen and done it all. His empire was in danger, and in that moment, I was his only ally. I didn't answer right away. But as the sound of gunfire grew louder, my instincts kicked in, and I realized that my survival depended on my willingness to face this reality head-on. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Good," he replied, his lips curling into a faint, cold smile. "Then let's make sure they understand who they're dealing with." We moved swiftly, navigating through the corridors of the mansion, the sound of the conflict growing louder with each step. Dominic had his men in place, securing the entrances, holding back the onslaught. But the attack wasn't just external. It was insidious. A quiet infiltration designed to break through his defenses from within. I had never seen Dominic in action like this. His every move was precise, calculated, and deadly. It was like watching a symphony of destruction play out before me, each strike, each decision part of a greater plan. He wasn't just a leader. He was a tactician, a master of war, and in that moment, I was no longer just a pawn in his game. I was an integral part of it, moving with purpose at his side, my knowledge of anatomy and medicine becoming a weapon. Every time we encountered an injured man or a hostile force, I was there, patching wounds, tending to the fallen, but also fighting back with everything I had. The shifting power dynamics between us were undeniable. No longer was I just the captive woman in Dominic Volkov's world. We were now partners, united in the fight for survival. His empire, his life, depended on both of us. There were moments when I saw the man behind the empire, the man who had suffered, who had bled, who had built everything from the ground up. But there were also moments when I saw him as something else, a ruthless leader, a predator who would do whatever it took to maintain control. And in those moments, the line between captor and captive blurred. I had chosen to stay, to fight beside him, and in doing so, I had given up my autonomy. I had allowed myself to become part of his world, to take on his battles as my own. But as the chaos unfolded, it became clear that the attack wasn't just about undermining Dominic. There was a traitor within his ranks, someone who had helped orchestrate this attack. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This was no random assault. It was an inside job. Dominic's cold eyes flicked to me as he moved through the carnage, issuing commands, taking charge. He was everywhere at once, his presence overwhelming, his control absolute. But even he couldn't escape the truth. "I know who it is," he said quietly, as we made our way toward the central command center. "I know who's behind this." My heart raced. "Who?" "A traitor," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Someone close to you." The words hung in the air like a threat, the weight of them pressing down on me. The only people I had trusted in this world, Dominic's men, the ones who had sworn loyalty to him, couldn't be counted on. And one of them had sold him out. One of them had turned against him, against us. My breath caught in my chest as the implications set in. Who could it be? Someone who knew everything about our operations. Someone who had access to everything. Someone I had trusted. Dominic's reaction was chilling. He didn't show emotion, not like Xander had. There was no sense of betrayal, no sense of loss. There was only cold, calculating rage. He had been betrayed before, many times, and he knew exactly how to deal with it. "There is no place for disloyalty in my world," he said, his voice low and deadly. "And there's no forgiveness for it." I didn't know how to feel. The man I had once thought of as a monster was showing me something far darker. His unyielding control. There was no room for weakness, no place for compassion. In Dominic's world, loyalty was everything. And those who betrayed him, those who crossed him, didn't live to tell the tale. The traitor's identity was revealed in the midst of the chaos. It was one of Dominic's trusted enforcers, a man who had been by his side for years. The betrayal hit hard. Dominic's empire wasn't just under attack from the outside. It had been infected by a cancer within. The man's punishment was swift. There was no trial, no hesitation. Dominic Volkov didn't waste time on mercy. The traitor was eliminated without ceremony, his body left as an example to anyone who dared defy the king. In the aftermath of the attack, as we stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, Dominic turned to me, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity I had never seen before. "You've proven yourself, Amelia," he said, his voice softer, but still commanding. "I don't know what it is about you, but you've earned my respect. You're more than just an asset. You're part of my empire now." There was no going back. As I stood there, breathing in the aftermath of the battle, I realized the truth. I was trapped. In Dominic Volkov's world, survival wasn't just about outlasting the dangers around you. It was about loyalty, absolute, unwavering loyalty. And now, my loyalty was no longer something I could control. It belonged to him. The power dynamics had shifted, and I had become an integral part of his empire. But that didn't mean I had control. The boundaries between us were still blurry, still uncertain, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed on me with every passing day. But I had made my choice, and in this world, where survival was everything, there was no room for doubt. The moment I stepped into Dominic Volkov's office, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The weight of the decision I had made weeks ago, the choice to stay, to survive in this world, now felt heavier than ever. I could feel the eyes of his empire on me, the suffocating pressure of loyalty being tested. And I realized that, for all my attempts to stand on my own, for all the self-righteousness I had held on to, the time for independence was over. It had been building up to this. The constant dance between captor and captive. The alliances formed in shadows, the lines crossed, the blood spilled. I had become so entwined in Dominic's world that escape no longer seemed possible. His empire, his power, had consumed me. Whether I liked it or not, I was now part of it. But today, Dominic was offering me something I hadn't expected. A choice. And with it, an ultimatum. "You've done well so far, Amelia," Dominic said, his voice as cold and calculating as ever. He sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood. His gaze, sharp as always, never left mine as he observed me, waiting for something. "But now, we need to discuss your future." His words sent a chill through me. A moment like this could only mean one thing. This was the ultimate test. Dominic Volkov wasn't a man who dealt in half measures. He didn't allow uncertainty to linger for long. Everything in his world, everything he built, was a precise calculation, a move made with a single goal in mind, to stay on top. "You've proven yourself loyal to me, Amelia," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "But I need to know, are you with me, completely? Or are you just here for convenience?" His gaze locked onto mine, steady and unwavering. I could feel the weight of the question bearing down on me, each word like a stone falling into a dark abyss. The decision I made now would define my future, and deep down, I knew that my survival in this world depended on the choice I made in this moment. "I don't offer loyalty lightly," Dominic said, his tone growing colder. "You've served me well, but now it's time to take your place. Either you fully commit to this empire, to me, or you leave. But understand this. If you leave, you will leave with nothing. No protection, no resources, no safety. You'll be alone. You'll be a target. And no one will care." His words hung in the air like a sword, poised to fall at any moment. I had no illusions left about Dominic Volkov. I knew how ruthless he could be. I had seen it firsthand. But the truth was, I didn't know how to live outside of this world anymore. I had become a part of it, whether I had wanted to or not. Dominic had made sure of that. His eyes never left mine as he continued, the air thick with tension. "This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about power. And if you want to be part of that, if you want to matter, you need to make a choice. Right now." I took a breath, feeling the weight of his words press down on me. There was no escaping it now. I had already made my choice, even if I hadn't fully acknowledged it until this moment. But the reality of it, the finality of it, was something I hadn't anticipated. "I stay," I said, my voice steady but laced with a rawness I couldn't hide. "I've already made my choice." A small almost imperceptible smile touched Dominic's lips. It was a smile that lacked warmth, that spoke of something darker, a recognition of my decision, and perhaps a hint of satisfaction in knowing that I had fully committed to his world. "Good," he said, "because in this world, loyalty is everything, and now that you've made your choice, there's no turning back. You're mine, Amelia, and that means I expect you to fight, not just for me, but for this empire. I expect you to use your skills, your knowledge, and your influence to further what we've built. You're not just a physician anymore, you're a partner." The words stung. A partner. Was that all I was now? A tool in his grand design? A cog in the machine that was his empire? Or was there more to it? There had been moments, fleeting as they were, when I saw Dominic as something more than just a ruthless leader. There had been moments when I thought I saw the man behind the empire, the man who had suffered, who had bled, and who now fought to maintain control over everything. But those moments were always followed by the cold reality of his world. A world where loyalty meant survival, but disloyalty meant death. "And now," Dominic said, his voice sharp and commanding, "we finish this. The enemies who think they can tear down my empire will learn the price of underestimating me. And you, Amelia, will help me bring them to their knees." It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power. And now, I had no choice but to embrace the role he had given me. The last remaining threads of my independence, the last vestiges of the life I had once dreamed of, were severed. I had become an instrument of Dominic Volkov, a healer, yes, but also a force in his world. And as the realization settled deep in my bones, I understood the true cost of loyalty. There was no turning back now. But loyalty, once given, is a dangerous thing. As the days passed, my role in Dominic's empire became more entrenched. I was no longer just his physician. I was his confidant, his strategist, his right hand. He had made me part of his world, and in doing so, he had given me power I had never anticipated. But with that power came responsibility. And as Dominic's empire continued to grow, so did the danger surrounding it. I had thought the betrayal from within had been the worst of it, but I was wrong. It was just the beginning. Xander. I had thought he was gone, his betrayal too deep, too personal for him to ever return. But I was wrong. Xander resurfaced, just when I thought I had finally severed all ties to my past. The moment he reappeared was as sudden as it was inevitable. One moment, I was in Dominic's office, reviewing plans for the next phase of his operations, and the next. The door slammed open. I turned, my heart dropping in my chest. There he was. Xander. His eyes locked onto mine, the same familiar intensity that had once captivated me. But this time, there was no warmth, there was no love, there was only rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" Xander spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're untouchable now, wrapped up in this monster's empire?" I stood frozen, every instinct in me telling me to run, to escape this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. Not now. Not anymore. "You betrayed me, Xander," I said, my voice a whisper of the woman I had once been. "You left me to die. You threw me away. And now you come back seeking revenge?" The words hung between us like a cold wind, but they were nothing compared to the confrontation that followed. Dominic stepped forward, his expression one of calculated indifference. "You've returned, Xander," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But you've come to the wrong place." The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as Xander and Dominic faced off, the past between them igniting the space with unspoken animosity. Xander had come back for more than just vengeance. He had come to reclaim what he thought was his. But Dominic wasn't going to let that happen. Amelia was forced to make the final decision. Where did her loyalty truly lie? With the man who had betrayed her, or with the man who had claimed her, body and soul? In that final moment, she realized that there was no choice. Dominic Volkov was her world now, her future, her survival. And as Xander faded into the past, she stepped fully into her new reality. The weight of Dominic Volkov's gaze was heavier than ever as I stood before him, every step closer to him pulling me further away from everything I once thought I wanted. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment I knew would eventually come. The final choice, the decision that would seal my fate once and for all. The last shreds of my independence, the life I had imagined outside of this world, were slipping through my fingers, and I knew I had no choice but to decide. I had already committed to his empire in ways I had never intended. I had survived on his terms, and now, Dominic was asking me to make my place permanent, to become an essential part of his world, his empire. But there was one last test, one final choice. We were standing in his office, the usual cool steel and marble surroundings now feeling like the very walls were closing in. The room was quieter than usual, the air thicker with tension. Dominic sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled, watching me with those cold, stormy eyes that had become so familiar in these months. There was no warmth in them, no gentleness. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. "You've earned your place here, Amelia," Dominic said, his voice low, controlled. His eyes were hard, unwavering. "But I'm giving you one last choice, one final decision." I held my breath, bracing myself for what came next. I knew deep down that this would be the moment that defined the rest of my life. This would be the decision that either chained me to this world forever or set me free. "You can stay with me, fully, completely. You can take your place at my side, as my partner in this empire," he continued, his voice calm, as if he were offering me a simple choice between two roads. "Or you can leave. Walk away. But know this, if you leave, you will be hunted. My enemies will see to that. You'll be a target. Forever. No protection, no safety, nothing. You'll be alone. I looked at him, the weight of his words sinking deep into me. He wasn't offering freedom. Not really. He was giving me a chance to embrace his world or be cast out into the chaos of it. He knew the risks of both choices. I swallowed hard, my thoughts racing. My mind flashed back to everything that had brought me here. The betrayal by Xander, the brutal world I had been forced into, the violence, the bloodshed, the way Dominic had shown me what it meant to survive in this empire. The question gnawed at me. Could I leave? Could I walk away and somehow make it out there, free, unscathed by the web of enemies Dominic had built over his empire? Would I be able to live with the constant fear of reprisal, knowing that I would never be able to escape his influence or the enemies he had cultivated? Or was I already too far gone? Had I already given too much of myself to him, to the empire he had created, to walk away from it all? My gaze drifted to the floor for a moment as I took a deep breath, steadying myself. There was no going back now. Not really. I had already crossed too many lines. I had already accepted too much of this world. When I looked up again, Dominic was watching me, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. Was it a flicker of something softer? Something almost human? Or was I imagining it, desperately hoping for any glimpse of warmth in the cold machine that was his empire? "You'll never be free. Not really," Dominic said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "You've already crossed the line, Amelia. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. The question is whether you accept it fully, whether you embrace the power, the control, the position I'm offering you." I knew what he was offering. I had already seen the power of his empire, the reach he had, and how much I had become a part of it. My medical expertise, my intellect, my ability to manipulate the inner workings of his empire had all been valuable. But more than that, I had proven myself loyal. I had survived in this world, and that survival had forged a bond. One of necessity, yes, but also something deeper. In his eyes, I wasn't just a physician anymore. I was a trusted ally, a partner. And now, I had to decide if that was a role I could truly accept. There was a time when I would have walked away from all of this. I would have left, unburdened by the chains of loyalty or power. I would have found a way to carve my own path, to live free of the blood and violence that had become the backdrop of my life. But now, I wasn't sure I could survive without Dominic. I had become too entangled in his world, too dependent on the safety his empire provided. Even if that safety was wrapped in violence and fear. I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me, the walls closing in as the seconds stretched into eternity. Dominic didn't rush me. He didn't speak again until I had made up my mind. "Make your choice," he said, his voice quiet, but the finality in it was unmistakable. "You know what it means." I closed my eyes for a moment, taking in the silence around us. I thought about my past, about the woman I had been before all of this, before Dominic Volkov had become my reality. And I thought about the woman I had become, the survivor, the one who had learned to embrace the power he had offered, even if it came with a price. I had already accepted my role in his world, and I knew deep down that there was no going back. "I stay," I said, my voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of my decision. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose the Empire." Dominic's eyes flickered for just a moment, a subtle shift in his expression. Then, with a slow nod, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of satisfaction tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good, Amelia," he said softly. "You've made the right choice." It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power. And I had chosen to embrace it, to become part of it, to carve my place in the empire Dominic Volkov had built. And in that moment, I realized that I had stopped being a victim. I had stopped being someone who ran from the danger, from the darkness. I had become a player in Dominic's world, an integral part of his empire, his trusted partner, and, for better or worse, his equal. The choice was made. I was no longer a woman torn between two worlds. unsure of where I belonged. Dominic had given me the power to shape my own future, even if that future was uncertain. I was no longer the helpless woman caught between betrayal and survival. I was Dominic Volkov's partner, and my place in his empire was solidified. But as I looked at him, the man who had claimed me in his own way, I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for me in the long run. What would this choice cost me in the end? There was no going back now. As I sat there, the weight of my decisions settling over me, I realized that I had transformed. I had gone from a woman desperate to escape the criminal world to someone who had embraced it, who had become a part of it. I was no longer the woman I had once been. I had found strength in my new identity, in accepting that I could no longer run from the darkness that surrounded me. Dominic Volkov's world was dangerous, brutal, and unforgiving. But it was mine now. And that meant I had power to shape my future, power to command my place in this empire. I was no longer a pawn, I was a player, and this was my world now.